You're listening to the Tank Magazine podcast. On this episode, Lily Owen Rowlands, assistant editor at Tank, is joined by Clare Birchall, senior lecturer in contemporary culture at King's College London, and author of the book Knowledge Goes Pop, From Conspiracy Theory to Gossip. They discuss her essay Becky with the Good Hair on gossip's power to disrupt conventional ideas about knowledge.
Hello, Claire.
Hello, Lily.
So you wrote this essay on gossip for our gossip issue, and I just wanted to ask you if you can explain a little bit how you became interested in gossip, or at least transparency, conspiracy, and those kind of themes.
Yeah, so gossip is actually one example of a few that I take in a book about popular knowledges. So I've come up with this term, popular knowledges, to think about a whole range of communicative phenomena, in a sense, that would constitute alternative ways of constructing knowledge about the world. So conspiracy theory is sort of my main example of that, and the way that it produces a very different understanding and of the world, and a very different way of trying to mobilise knowledge about it. And so gossip, it seemed to me, was a sort of very good example of that. So they're both examples of popular knowledges which produce different sorts of ways of thinking about the world beyond scientific rationalism, and pose particular problems for scientific rationalism and sort of more legitimated ways of knowing. So what I do in the book is gossip and conspiracy theory really become, they're sort of used, I'm using them metaphorically in a way, to sort of think about that very close relationship between the sorts of things that we say as academics or journalists, or, you know, from positions of supposed rationality, and these other ways of knowing, which are usually situated as being a bit crazy, unfounded, immoral, or whatever it is, and trying to think about the very close relationship between those forms of knowledge.
I know that you sort of, in the piece at least, think about gossip in the ways that it sets the limits for what we call knowledge. So it has that sort of oppositional function. But I wonder if there was a way that you can define gossip that is comprehensive, or at least adequate to how we might understand what it does.
I mean, there are lots of competing definitions of what gossip is, and in those definitions they often involve some kind of moral judgment about the thing that they're talking about in the very explanation of it. But I would come up with something quite neutral, actually, and just think about gossip as that which stages an encounter with the undecidability of knowledge. So it's a statement that isn't really particularly interested in its origins, and so it's past, and it doesn't really know where it's going to go either. And it's a statement about the world, or about people in the world, that might not necessarily be true or verifiable, but which nevertheless is a kind of speculative endeavour or intervention into the world, which may or may not take hold at some point. So lots of things are said in a gossipy way, and only some of them are going to sort of have purchase in the world.
But maybe we can hear your essay now, Becky with the Good Hair.
In the wake of the Brexit referendum, when cosmopolitans were stumbling through the newly isolated capital with an unnerving sense of the unheimlich, the uncanny, and, for Freud especially, the unhomely, and the Conservative Party was honing the art of backstabbing, one of Boris Johnson's aides accused Michael Gove of being a gossip. The actual words Ben Wallace, MP, wrote in the Daily Telegraph were, "Michael seems to have an emotional need to gossip, particularly when drink is taken, as it all too often seemed to be." With its connotations of femininity, messiness, secretion, the label Gossipy Gove was central to his downfall. No greater slur is there to bestow upon a man. Overnight, he shifted from arch Machiavellian, which he might have been able to get away with, to a loose-lipped lush with a taste for gutter talk. More than Gove's reputation as a gossip, though, I'm interested in the reputation of gossip itself. Gossip certainly has a lot of negative connotations to contend with, but how has it also been read as a positive force in society? Rather than resting with this bad gossip, good gossip binary, I'm going to ask Beyoncé and her love rival, Becky with the good hair, to help reposition gossip as no less than a way to open up an ethical encounter with knowledge. First, those negative accounts. How exactly did gossip accumulate such unseemly connotations? After all, in terms of etymology, gossip began life rather innocently, meaning simply God's sib, a godparent. By the 18th century, gossip was feminized through its use to describe female friends invited to a birth, and so Dr. Johnson, in his 1755 dictionary, defines a gossip as, quote, one who runs about tattling like women at a lying-in. And during the 19th century, the noun is extended to the type of conversation gossips indulge in, idle talk. While gossip as idle tittle-tattle emerges relatively late, the practice has a prehistory, going by other names. Tuning into that prehistory reveals a damning account. Gossipy practices get vilified most in various religions. According to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Religion, for example, the rabbis of classical Judaism in late antiquity actually positioned slander, tale-bearing, and evil talk as worse than the three cardinal sins of murder, immorality, and idolatry, and that indulging in lashon hara was seen as akin to denying the existence of God. In Islam, gossip is covered by the term al-ghibah. One particularly vivid deterrent can be found in Sunan Abu Dawud, a collection of sayings and deeds of Prophet Muhammad, recorded by Imam Abu Dawud. The Prophet said, when I was taken up to heaven, I passed by people who had nails of copper and were scratching their faces and their breasts. I said, who are these people, Gabriel? He replied, they are those who were given to backbiting and who aspersed people's honour. The message from the Quran is that even listening to gossip is risky, because on the day of reckoning, Allah will inquire into every act of hearing or seeing in the heart. A good Muslim walks away when the talk turns to gossip. These religious sentiments are echoed in other realms. Consider, for example, the way the indiscreet lover is shunned in tracts on courtly love from the 12th century, or the distrust of hearsay in a court of law. One of the most critical disciplines, however, has to be philosophy. Whether it's Aristotle's great-souled man who goes out of his way to avoid being tarnished with gossip's brush, or Heidegger's condemnation of idle talk for its indication that the speaker is more interested in the claim made about an object than understanding the essential nature of the object itself. Gossip is fashioned as a diversion from the pursuit of truth. Throughout all of these negative accounts lingers a misogynist whiff. The distaste for gossip reflects a more general denigration of the feminine. Gossip, long associated with women, is the chosen mode, in this view, of those with no important role in the world. It pitifully apes the full and purposeful discussions that take place in the masculine public sphere. That's why the suggestion that Gove's informal attempts to gauge and influence the political climate amounted to gossip was so damning. But there is another, more positive story about gossip in the ether. With his eye on the psychology of markets, Ralph L. Rosno claims a special place for gossip, situating it as small talk with social purposes. Some sociologists and anthropologists laud gossip for being a bonding and socializing force, essential to the healthy functioning of communities. Others praise it for democratizing knowledge, seeing it as a way of finding things out when more formal modes of inquiry are closed to us or not up to the job. Patricia Mellencamp suggests that gossip might trash the long paternity of sacred narrative conventions and Cartesian logic. Another Patricia, Maya Spax, author of a masterful account of gossip in literature, suggests it provides subordinated classes with a mode of communication beyond an official public culture from which they are excluded. Feminists discuss and rehabilitate gossip as a form of knowledge exchange beyond patriarchal control. Gossip here is a form of resistance and challenge. I have sympathy with negative and positive approaches to gossip, but fear they both miss the point. Whether commentators are bemoaning or celebrating gossip's outsider, disruptive, disreputable status, the opposition between knowledge proper and gossip is kept largely in place. But gossip is not separable from knowledge in this way. It's right there at the beginning. The important thing about gossip is that it is at the heart of cognition, conditioning any history of knowledge or claim to knowledge put forward. Gossip makes the very idea of knowledge thinkable. This is easily explained with reference to the history of knowledge, an account neither unified nor linear and susceptible to moments of splitting off or borrowing. Because textually manifested knowledge can always be cited and quoted, a necessary state if it is to become ratified as knowledge and hold some kind of force, it is subject to misquoting or citing out of context. It is open to abuse. Knowledge is always subject to the possibility of degrading into just gossip, mere speculation, or simply illusion, of moving further and further from justified true belief. Rather than the possibility of degradation coming after knowledge has been secured, it accompanies knowledge throughout. In fact, knowledge cannot be carried forward without this possibility, because without citation, repetition, borrowing, all the things that make knowledge vulnerable to becoming further from the truth and so more like gossip, knowledge would not count as knowledge. No one would be able to recognize it as knowledge. If gossip conditions knowledge, the openly uncertain status of gossip's authority and authenticity, it seems to be accepted that it may or may not be true, affects the authority and authenticity of all knowledge. Gossip makes us address the mystical foundations of authority, as Kant would have it. So we can say that gossip exposes an undecidability at the heart of all knowledge. Is it true or false? Found or created? Sound or crazy? Meaningful or meaningless? And because it is undecidable, it forces an encounter with the decision, which in certain brands of continental philosophy is ethical in nature. This is important because it means that gossip forces us, every step of the way, to move outside our pre-decided, often political leanings to encounter knowledge anew. Onto this shifting epistemological and ethical ground enter Becky with the good hair. At the end of Beyoncé's track Sorry, just one of 12 on the album Lemonade, alluding to the infidelities of a man who may or may not be the real Jay-Z, is the tantalizing line, "He only want me when I'm not there. He better call Becky with the good hair." Social media was awash with gossip about Becky. The virtual finger moved from Rachel Roy to Rita Ora. Alongside this game of naming and shaming, a different form of speculation was also emerging, one that focused on the politics behind the figure of the Becky, as she might relate to African American women. Since Sir Mix-a-Lot's mainstream 1992 hit Baby Got Back, which began with a prissy, judgmental Valley girl saying, "Oh my god, Becky, look at her butt. It is so big. She looks like one of those rap guys' girlfriends. She's just so black." The name has been used in US black culture to refer to a certain kind of white woman. In light of this, we could infer that Beyoncé's Becky is white, average, basic. Clearly, Roy, whose father is of Bengali origin, and Ora, whose parents are from Albania, are not, to borrow a phrase from Damon Young of VerySmartBrothers.com, the Beckiest of Beckys. Nevertheless, the line from Beyoncé has opened up a conversation about a racialized aesthetic ideal that has historically penalized black womanhood. In fact, the application of the label Becky to Roy or Ora would be to accuse them of conforming to white cultural standards and denying their ethnicities. While a limited and all too literal interpretation of Beyoncé's lyrics might only result in a witch hunt, all this talk about Becky leads to a culturally and politically more important place. But the beauty of speculation and gossip is that we do not and cannot know. We don't know if Becky is a real person. We don't know if this line pitches women against each other by blaming the other woman instead of the cheating spouse, just one woman's personal expression of jealousy, or if it is a statement about the expendability of black female subjectivity in the wider racialized economy. Gossip keeps all possibilities alive. It honors the proliferation of reading and interpretation, which means that a text, including Sorry, is a site of contestation, a machine endlessly generating meanings that are sometimes at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. Depending on our political leanings, we might be predisposed to a particular reading of Beyoncé's Becky reference or Gove's alleged predilection for gossip. But if we take gossip seriously, the idea that it stages an encounter with the undecidable foundation of knowledge, then we can say that gossip requires a leap into the unknown, a decision. Late French philosopher Jacques Derrida claimed that for a decision to be a real decision, it cannot follow a pre-existing path. We cannot rely on our political sympathies, for example, to tell us the way forward. If we did, it would not be a decision, but merely a programmatic unfolding. In answer to the question, who is Becky, we could say that Becky is gossip, that speculative heart of knowledge. Many an op-ed tells us that these are worrying post-truth, anti-expert times. Politicians repeat unfounded claims constantly, whether it's the gossip, intelligence, that told us Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction to justify an invasion, the Leave campaign's insistence that the EU costs the UK £350 million a week without mentioning the amount it receives, or Trump's claim, just one piece of gossip among the countless others that littered his presidential campaign, that Obama, quote, is the founder of ISIS, and Hillary the co-founder. Facebook has been accused of circulating false news stories and creating ideologically fixed, self-affirming knowledge silos that mean we never encounter an alternative viewpoint and, crucially, never need make a real decision. Gossip presented as truth is an abomination. It is the staple of the demagogue. Gossip qua gossip presents us with an undecidability between knowledge and non-knowledge and presses the question of responsibility upon us. This decision-making about the knowledge we encounter is one possible description of politics. Far from being a waste of time, then, gossip, when we can see it for what it is, stages an important scene of engagement. So thank you, Becky with the good hair, and Michael a little thin on top.
You used two examples in the piece, or at least two figures, Gove and Beyonce, to illustrate the reputation of gossip and its relation to what we deem legitimate sources of knowledge. So what is it about gossip that makes it so ubiquitous across culture and politics?
It doesn't take an academic to say this probably, but in the sense that you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be an authority. You are allowed to engage in the speculative exercise without having to train yourself in any way, without having qualifications. Whereas lots of knowledge comes from a place of authority, gossip doesn't have that as something to back it up. And so we're constantly forced into assessing what it is exactly that we're encountering every time.
I guess we could talk a little bit about bad gossip. You talk about the bad gossip, good gossip binary and how that's not necessarily what interests you. But obviously the idea of gossip carries with it a sort of ethical baggage. I guess that has its roots in religious doctrine, which then carries through to ideas about etiquette. I'm kind of interested in where the harm might be done in gossip.
That's a really interesting question. I think that there is lots of questions around reputation, and I wouldn't want to suggest that there aren't real effects on real people, in the world and their lived experience because of the sorts of things that gossip positions. What I'm trying to do is displace that conversation really and take one step back and think about what kind of knowledge is this knowledge. And even just calling it a knowledge actually is quite controversial because of the things that we've said around, it doesn't seem to have this authority, it doesn't really have the foundations in the same way. And so I guess what I'm trying to do is move from a thinking about gossip in terms of moralism, which seems to me unhelpful, and thinking about it more as staging this ethical encounter with the otherness of knowledge that forces this decision upon us. So I suppose I want to rescue it from not ethics as commonly understood, but from this sort of moralism that seems to address it and position it as really bad and awful and just out there.
Yeah, so it seems to me you're not trying to resuscitate knowledge in the kind of what is traditionally feminist, or at least the idea of standpoint epistemology. So certain subordinated groups, people of colour, women, working class people, might have a knowledge which has been traditionally closeted or not listened to. You're not saying we should elevate these subordinated voices to the position of legitimate knowledge. You're not advocating that revolutionary potential of gossip.
No, because not in this instance. I think there are places where I would advocate, voice and being heard in other ways. But I think in this instance, because that's where you could get into sticky ground over conspiracy theories, right? Because I want to rehabilitate or reread conspiracy theory, the discourse, but I don't necessarily feel the need to defend conspiracy theorists as a marginalised group. But what I think is the discourse around those things, around gossip and around conspiracy theory and around other forms of popular knowledge, that I think is where the damage, lies. So I think that's where the danger is.
So that ethical encounter, it does seem to me the idea of choosing what we'll deem knowledge or non-knowledge is a very continental idea. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those who would sort of propound that idea of perpetually choosing. So you mentioned Derrida, who thinks that in order to make a real decision, it has to be one that you've sort of freely chosen.
He talks about a leap into madness, that the decision, the moment of the decision, is a sort of madness, that because you can't have an ideology that leads you there, you can't have a predisposed politics that leads you there, you can't have a morality that leads you there. It's a sort of necessity of being able to make any kind of real decision at all. And so it's a leap into the unknown,
pushing oneself forward into this perpetual state of possibility, of always being open.
Yeah, it's the openness that I'm really trying to talk about, really, because if you come into the realm of knowledge, whether it's gossip, conspiracy theory, any other form of knowledge, already knowing what you think about it, already deciding what it is, and that goes for, say, politics too, right? If we go into the world already knowing or thinking we know what constitutes a political action or politics in general, then we haven't really encountered it. We haven't really made any decisions about what the political might be. And so this is what I'm trying to say about knowledge too, that if we already think we know what knowledge is, then we haven't really made any sort of radical decision about that. And that's not an ethical encounter, because the ethical encounter is about encountering the other.
The way you frame it in your book is there's a long passage about the Iraq War and how there's a certain responsibility that comes from making this decision between what we think knowledge is. Do you think that that is more pressing than ever, or it seems to have entered the discourse in a way that might suggest that people are making those decisions?
Well, I think it's different, actually. I think the rise of, if we take it as a real thing, whatever that might mean, if we take the rise of post-truth, then I think what's happened now is that the way, it seems to me like when gossip is presented as truth, that is a problem, and that's that then you're encountering a form of authoritarianism, because that's just as much trying to secure truth as any other more legitimated form of knowledge is, in a sense. And so I think that when gossip is presented as truth, you are encountering a real issue there, and that's what I see with post-truth presentations. It has a lot of similarities with gossip. That's why I want to save gossip from being the same as post-truth, because I think that if post-truth politics is about trying to put an emotive story out there that is more important than any factual guarantee of any factual content that's in it, then gossip could also be described in that way. But I think that the difference is that gossip stages this encounter with the other, whereas post-truth reduces that encounter with the other. It's a precarious distinction and it's a precarious moment. And I think that, the more you go into knowledge silos, the less encountering of the other you have to do. And that's when you get this bifurcation of knowledge, or that is politicized, that is drawn along political lines, and so I think it is important to open ourselves to that, but it's hard because
it's more comfortable.
It's more comfortable over here.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe through the iTunes Store. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.